Welcome to Becoming Church, the podcast where we discuss how the message and movement of Jesus is not just about becoming Christians, but about becoming the church. I'm your host, Kristen Mockler-Young, and I'm so glad you are joining the conversation. Welcome back to the Becoming Church podcast. This is your host, Kristen, and I am here today with Mariko Clark. Hello.
Hi, Kristen.
Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to chat with you.
Awesome. So we are going to talk today about the Bible and the Bible's, especially in relation to children, and the new Bible that you've basically created and written on your own called the Book of Belonging.
Yes. I have a story Bible for kids. I feel like that is important. Some of the criticism we've gotten was saying you can't add to the Bible, and we're like, no, that's not what we're doing. It's a story Bible for kids. Definitely not trying to add to scripture.
Yeah. So what inspired this? Because I know that there are other storybook Bibles, there are other kids Bibles.
Yeah.
So what inspired the Book of Belonging?
There's lots of them out there, and we own a few of them. But what sort of started the whole thing a few summers ago, my daughter and I have 3 kids, and my oldest at the time was like 5. And she was telling me just about this story she had been reading in our Bible. And then sort of out of nowhere, she goes, "Mom, does God love boys more than girls?" And I was like, whoa. Where does that come from? Where did you get that idea? I raised you better than that.
You're like, who were you listening to?
Yeah, exactly. And she's like, in her little 5-year-old deductive reasoning, she's like, well, in the Bible that you guys read us, there's only 2 girl stories and the rest are boy stories. So, that's the conclusion she had come to. I'm like, there's no way that's true. So
I'm trying to think. I'm like Mary and Ruth, Esther.
The other one in her Bible, at least, was Rachel and Leah.
Oh, okay.
And those were the 2. And I'm like, there's no way. So I go home and I flip through, and sure enough, there's only 2 female-centric stories in her Bible. I'm like, that's weird. And like I said, we have a couple other ones. I started flipping through those, and it's like, once I started seeing it, I couldn't stop seeing it. That female characters are vastly underrepresented, not just in the stories, but even in the illustrations. Because I think, someone would argue, well, the Bible's a lot about Jesus. So of course, a lot of the stories are going to be about a man, but we know that Jesus had female disciples, and that there certainly were women in the crowds at any sort of gathering that would be listening to him. And that's just not depicted in most of these story Bibles, in the illustrations even, which was frustrating to me because I have 2 younger kids who they don't read, but they'll sit there and look through the pictures. So the story of God that they're ingesting is through imagery, and what they're seeing, the story that those pictures are telling them, is that God's family is a white man surrounded by other white men, and like that's the extent of it. And that was really sad and frustrating to me, because I've had beautiful experiences in church and certainly haven't experienced a lot of, the misogyny that we know is out there. So that really grieved me, knowing that my kids would be ingesting that, even just sort of subconsciously or inadvertently. So that sort of got me started on this journey of, okay, well then I want to find a story Bible that does more of this. So I started searching around and looking at all of the products that are on the market, and had a tough time finding what I was looking for. And it was one of those things where once I started pulling at the thread, I'm like, okay, well, if I'm going to be looking for more girl stories, then I'd like to see a brown Jesus. Well, while I'm looking for that, I might as well see if I can find, more stories that or stories that are less about morality and more about identity. Like some of these story Bibles lean pretty heavily on sort of like the fairy tale tradition of like wrapping up each story with like and here's the moral of the story. Here's how to be.
Here's your
person.
to do. Yes.
Yep. Which I think it has its place as far as application goes, but I think it goes awry sometimes in these story Bibles because kids are so literal. I'm getting a little off topic, but
no, it's okay.
Kids are so literal that I think we have this this great intention to instruct them. But I think sometimes when we make the point of a Bible story, um, the morality or the to do, like you said,
Right.
then kids, some, at least my kids, start to believe that God loves them because of what they do and not who they are.
Mhm.
um and then, the natural way to ease that sort of anxiety for a kid is just behavior modification. They just start to act in different ways, and we know that has no real impact on their heart, um
Yeah.
or at least lasting impact. And then I think a lot of us experience that as kids, and then we're bound up in this moral hierarchy, and then as adults, like, that really doesn't hold for us. It's not
Right.
lasting or sustainable.
Well, I'd say I agree with everything you're saying because
Yeah.
that's how I grew up. And it
Yeah.
wasn't that my parents purposely instilled that,
Hmm.
but in my own interpretation in through Sunday school and youth group and all the things. Yes, it was very much walking away with any Bible story or any lesson. It really was, okay, and here's now what you do, because
Hmm.
that's what, Jesus did, or Jesus's friends did, or the
Yeah.
disciples did. And yeah, when you find that you mess up, then
Yeah.
like we all do, because
Yeah.
we all make mistakes and none of us
Yeah.
can live up to this. You're right. I have then gone into my adult life going, I have to do better. I have to be better. I
Hmm.
have to perform for God to
Hmm.
love me. And even though I know that that's not actually true,
Yeah.
that does become our identity. That does
Sure.
become, when there is not a identity piece to match with that,
Hmm.
it just kind of takes on both.
Yeah. And it's tricky because those things that we pick up as kids are so foundational that, yeah, even as adults, when we do sort of take that apart and figure out, what we really do believe, or we have a like a more mature understanding of how it works. Those things are so embedded in us from the
Yeah.
time where we don't even have language for it, that I think is what scared me as a parent, was like knowing how kids' brains develop and being like, shoot, this is going to stick with them. I want to make sure that what's sticking with them is something that will grow with them, that is flexible and sustainable and life-giving. So
Yeah.
um,
Well,
that's
kudos
sort
to
of
you for
how.
trying to figure out, doing the hard work of figuring out how to teach them differently so that they're not then adults who are having to do the hard work of unlearning to
Yeah,
then try to relearn anyway, like so many of us are.
so many of us are. And yeah, I completely agree with you that a lot of times it's not that our parents necessarily went out of their way to instruct us poorly, or to put
Right.
these ideas in our head, but it's what we pick up, even reading between the lines as kids, and that is really tricky.
Yeah. I love that you talked about the illustrations, even
Hmm.
because I mean, as parents, we're told like read to your babies,
Hmm.
so they are taking in these visuals
Yeah.
from like one.
Yeah. Yeah.
How
And
have
they
you
and
how have you used or molded the illustrations in the book of
so I'm
Longing?
not the illustrator. I'm working with a good friend of mine. Her name's Rachel Eleanor. She's an incredible artist. And Rachel and I work really closely, collaboratively. She speaks a lot into my writing, and I speak into her illustrations. And she is so brilliant. I think what she's done a really good job. I think she's done two things. So the lack of female-centric stories, it's not the only issue that we were seeking to address, but it certainly is what sort of started that ball rolling. Um, but in my process, as I continue to be curious about kids' Bible resources, I started to notice these other choices that were being made, especially in the illustrations, things like skin color, ability, age, body shape and size.
Oh
and,
yeah.
and I started asking, what biases, either conscious or unconscious, am I passing down to my kids through these edits that these other illustrators are making? And I think Rachel does an incredible job of being really, really intentional. Even before she started illustrating for me, if you go back through her previous artwork, she's got all kinds of body shapes and sizes and abilities and skin tones. But I think the other thing she does really well is she's really whimsical and fantastical with her illustrations. And that was something I was so excited to introduce into the concept of a kid's Bible, that in one of our sample stories that you can read on our website, about Jesus calling his disciples, um, we were talking about how in so many of the kids' Bibles that are out there, you get to the New Testament, and almost every story has a really similar illustration of Jesus standing, the dudes around him, sort of in this like dynamic or like sort of static posture. And I told Rachel, I don't feel inspired by that. And I wouldn't be surprised if kids didn't. There's so much of what Jesus is doing, telling these parables, it's really imaginative and beautiful. He was a storyteller. But then we end up with these images in the Bible of just like people standing around.
Right.
So I was
and they all really look the same. Like
and they
all
all
the
look the
disciples
same.
are a copy and paste, but like this one has longer brown hair and this one has
Yes.
shorter brown hair and this one has a beard. But
Yeah.
like really,
But
they're all carbon copies.
Jesus is like the hottest one out of them.
Yeah.
Like he happens to be cuter.
Yes, he's
I've
like
noticed
shining
that.
a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. His hair is a little smoother. But Rachel did a really good job of we tried to think about like how can we convey these really beautiful concepts in a more imaginative way. So as far as like Jesus calling the 12 disciples in this story that I'm talking about, Rachel did this really cool thing. She has them in one of the illustrations riding on fish, because it's the story about fishing for men. And she says, when Jesus says like, you'll become fishers of men. And certainly they were fishers of women as well. So she has this illustration that kind of goes across the whole page of this school of fish. And then the disciples, male and female, riding on these fish. And she has done that throughout the book. And I think it's so important because I think it gives our kids these spaces to pour their wonder and their imagination into. And I think that's why Jesus told parables, was that he would be asked this really direct question. He would tell this sort of like evasive, vague story for people to sort of pour their understanding into.
Yeah.
And I think that that's sort of like the mini or like the kid version of that is these images that she does, I think, a really, really wonderful job of sort of pulling back on the literal.
I love that. I mean, kids are naturally curious.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sounds like this is going to allow and make room for that. And curiosity is a good thing. I think a lot of times people want to separate that from scripture and be like, nope, here's the answer. And this is what it is.
Yeah.
But really, if they're curious about it, they're going to want to know more about it. They're going to want to know more about the story and about who Jesus is. And then we're teaching them to think.
Yeah. Yeah. And
we're teaching them to ask questions.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that is the natural outcome of curiosity. What you're saying is like, we're teaching them to think and ask questions. We're teaching them to think critically. But I think that curiosity can be really scary for people who don't necessarily understand it or have it themselves.
Yeah.
It can feel like, well, curiosity equals doubts. Curiosity equals walking away from tradition. And that can feel really scary for some people. But I think especially for kids, it's so important for us to foster that. My friend Sarah, I don't know if you're friends with Sarah Schwarzenruber.
No.
Anyways,
I'll find her.
She's awesome. She's a pastor at a church out in Portland, Cascade, and she has a lot of resources for parents. But she's done a lot of academia level study on kids' resources and sort of the sustainability of kids' faith and how what the difference is between kids who, after they graduate from kids ministry of some sort, what's the difference between kids who still are interested in the Bible and who still would identify as a person of faith, and what's the difference between kids who grow up and they want nothing to do with it. And she tells it so much more intelligently, but for I think it's the first 10 years, she said the most important thing you can do for a kid if you want them to have a lifelong faith is to foster curiosity. Like that is the one thing. And when she told me that, I was like, yes, that is exactly, like, that's been my instinct as a parent. And that's what I've seen with my kids, that the more, flexibility I give them and the more wonder I make available to them, there is more interest. And that makes sense, right? Because every other resource they have is shoving them towards imagination and wonder.
Yeah.
And so for us to take Bible resources and be like, no. This is for study only. I mean, that's not going to foster any sort of interest or engagement on their part.
Yeah. And it makes it like school, which a lot of kids like school, but then they're in school all day long and they probably need a break from it. And I think even sometimes in education, I was a teacher for a long time, so I can speak into this a little bit.
I get it.
But there is a difference in, the classes where you're just having to learn like facts. And so are we presenting the Bible of just here's scriptures to memorize and things that you need to know about Jesus or the Israelites, or are we inviting them in to the story? You mentioned, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think you're right. And I think that we're sort of setting them up for failure if it does become sort of like a memorization, here's the facts thing, because we know as adults that there isn't always a cut and dried answer for every question that we have about scripture or about God. And so we're setting our kids up to sort of like be let down by their faith. If every time they have a question, we have a sort of a readily packaged answer with a bow on top of it, because that's not how life works. And that's not how God works in a wonderful way. Like, how disheartening would it be if God fit inside of my 6-year-old's mind? If she was like, got it. Like, what kind of God would that be to worship if my 6-year-old had a full concept of how it works?
She figured him out.
Yeah, that would be like, that wouldn't be worth any of my investment. So I think that, curiosity and wonder. And when it can feel really scary when our kids come to us with questions and we're like, I don't know. And sometimes it's like, I haven't studied enough, or like,
let's look it up together.
Let's look it up together. Or like, I kind of forget. But sometimes it's these I don't knows where you're like, I don't know. Like, lots of people debate about this. Lots of people, Meredith Miller, my friend, says, like, lots of people who love Jesus feel differently about this. And I think that's such a good line. But then there's the I don't knows where you're like, I don't know, because literally no human has ever been able to figure it out. And isn't that so wonderful? Isn't that so worthy of our worship? This thing that like none of us have been able to figure out. And that doesn't have to be so scary. And I think we can model wonder in a really joyous way for our kids, so that it doesn't have to lead to fear, which is I think what we see with some leaders, where it's like, I don't know, and that's so scary, we've got to nail this down. And then our kids grow up to be adults who are like, but I don't want to nail it down, so I guess I don't belong in this community of faith if I can't. So,
or I can't nail it down, and so therefore I failed. I think we connect like knowledge with performance.
Oh, for sure.
And going, okay, well, if you know the thing, then you're doing it right. We've got this idea that if you don't know, you've somehow failed, or you're not good enough, or you're not smart enough. And so, like you said, even just teaching our kids that I don't know can be a good thing. And that we may never know, but that it's not bad. And it doesn't mean that we're not smart enough to figure it out. Maybe we're just not meant to know. And it's the process that is the good part about it.
Yes, I love that.
So you talked about instilling wonder and contemplation, like a little bit through the illustrations. Do you do that at all? Like, I'm assuming in the story with the words and the text. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, that's something that was really important to me to build into the book. I have a background in educational publishing. And so this word pedagogy that I feel like I've used in interviews before, people are like, what does that mean? You're a teacher, you get it. So I wanted to build some pedagogy into it, which is really just like learning resources. And it was really important for me to build in some pedagogy about wonder, in really along the lines of what we were just talking about, of giving parents a place to put their I don't knows. So in some of one of our sample stories, actually, the 5 Fearless Sisters, that again, you can read on the website. It's from the Old Testament, and there's this moment in the story where Moses goes and talks to God. He sort of consults with God about this trial that's sort of going on for these 5 sisters. And then he comes back and is like, oh, God says this. And so we have this what we call a wonder moment at the end of that story, which is just sort of this little lockup that just creates space for I don't know. So it says, in the story, Moses talks to God. And throughout Moses's story, it says that Moses talked to God face to face as a man speaks to a friend. What do you think that was like? What do you think that God sounded like? What do you think Moses saw? What do you think he felt? And to sort of just give them this space of, my kids have asked me, like, what do you mean God spoke? What does God sound like? What is that? Like, we hear that in stories like that God spoke to these people. And I think, I've told my kids, like, I think it's different for every person, but like, I'm like, I don't know, kid. Like, I can tell you what it's like for me, but maybe it's different for you. And like, who knows what it was like for Moses? And that can feel really scary. So we sort of have built it into the story for parents to be like, what do you think? And to just like put it in our kids' hands and like think about it, like use your imagination, sit with that. And like, we don't have to come up with an answer together. We could just sit in that question and mystery, and we can sort of engage with the mystery in a way that is worshipful and intentional, instead of sort of shying away from it or trying to like hammer it down with an answer. So that's sort of like the wonder moment. The other lockup we've done is contemplative, or we are calling mindful moments, and that's just this idea. I have found meditation and mindfulness to be a really important tool in um, my faith journey over the past few years. And I have found it is most helpful in situations where I've got a lot of head knowledge. And I think a lot of us who grew up in the church have that, where it's like, we've got it all kind of locked up here, and it's difficult to engage with, especially in difficult or like grieving or confusing seasons. It's difficult to engage in our heart. And I have found a more meditative, mindful space a really life-giving way to sort of connect my head and my heart. And I know that in, I guess what you would call like the secular world, that's picking up ground, that mindfulness and meditation is like sort of a big movement. And I think that, that we're onto something, that we live in such a fast-paced world. There's so much noise, there's so much going on. Our kids rarely have a moment to even just sit by themselves, or be quiet. And the sort of if we look at Jesus as a model of like, where did Jesus go when he was feeling overwhelmed, or when he was, looking to engage his knowledge and his heart? And it's like, he went off to the wilderness, or he went away to a quiet place, he withdrew. And how can we give our kids permission and sort of a model for what that looks like for them? How do we pull them into like the three tenets of contemplative practices is solitude, silence, and stillness? How do we create practices for them to have solitude or silence? Like, silence is so rare for our kids these days, or to just like allow them to be still. And I think those are the really holy moments where they're sitting with these questions or with this mystery, or like they're having encounters with the Holy Spirit. Like, if we don't carve out those spaces, I worry for my kids that if I don't carve them out, that they won't encounter them organically, just with the pace of our world. And so we've locked that up at a couple of and some of the stories at the end will have this mindful moment where we have one that I really love. It's with a cup of tea. So you get yourself a little hot drink, like hot chocolate or tea, and you sort of walk these kids through, hold it with one hand and feel how that feels different from your other hand, sort of this like bodily engagement. Now hold your other hand with the hot hand. How does that feel? Put your face over the cup and feel the steam. So it's like sort of drawing them into their body. And then as you're sipping your drink, think back over the day. And it's sort of this modified examen practice, which is an Ignatian practice of like, think back over your day. Well, where was a moment where you felt like God was close to you, or where you noticed the fruit of the Spirit? Because I feel like sometimes that's easier for kids. Instead of being like, where was God there? You're like, where did you feel love? Where did you feel peace? Where was there gentleness? And have them, and then, think back over the day and like, where's a moment that felt really difficult, where you felt like sort of alone, and like, what did that feel like? And then, this is a contemplative moment that we put at the end of the story of Esther, because I found this out writing this story, that Esther is the only book of the Bible where the name of God is not mentioned at all. And so when I started writing, I'm like, shoot, how am I going to justify putting this in my Bible? And I ended up reading a Jewish rabbi, one of his commentaries, talking about like that the reason he thinks it was written that way was it was written when the Jews, this is such like a nerdy take on it, like such a rabbit trail, but it was written when the Jewish people were in exile, and they were likely, feeling very similar to how Esther felt, like a foreigner in a foreign land, wondering like, where is God in our experience? Like, it really doesn't feel like God's with us. It feels like kind of like God abandoned us. And so this rabbi thinks that it was supposed to mirror their experience, that like at a surface reading of Esther, God's not present. But then you go back and you look in all the nooks and the crannies and you see the peace and you see the love and you see the gentleness, and you have to go searching for God in the story. And, that's sort of the message we can take away from Esther is like, there's days where we can look back and be like, God wasn't with me. I felt totally abandoned.
Yeah.
And the message of Esther that we can take away is like, well, what if we look back over it? Where was God in like, the nooks and the crannies? Where was God when we go searching for him? And sometimes the search is really what brings us as close to God, or brings us sort of back in communion, is like through the act of searching, like
Right.
we engage. And that's where the beauty sort of comes out. Anyways, that's one of the sort of mindful moments we have locked up for kids.
That is, Mariko, that is so beautiful. And I mean, and it really is something that I'm a very busy person. And I try to monitor that for my kids. Like I try to put, boundaries in place of like for our family, we don't do sports and activities on the weekend because like I'm a pastor, I work on Sundays. Saturday is our only day that we don't have something. Now we also have the birthday parties and we have the family dinners and like
it never ends.
The things that pop up, but I'm like, that is a place that I can kind of protect one day for our family. But even if you were thinking, I just kind of, I don't know if convicted is the right word, but I was just reminded that like, no, I need to also teach my kids to be silent. I need to teach my kids to pause, because they're not going to learn that in our lives. Or even, I know from watching me, I'm a consumer. So I'm constantly listening to a podcast or music or something. And I could model how simple it would be for me to model doing the dishes in silence. I probably wouldn't even have to tell them what I would do. They would come in and be like, why is it so quiet in here? And that could lead to the discussion, but it truly is. We have to think of all of these practices as something that we need to teach our kids, because they're not, we can't assume that they're just going to know,
Yeah. I think that's fantastic. Yeah. I'm right there with you.
So you mentioned a little bit how engaging, is how we come back to God, like digging in is how we come back to God. I feel like when a lot of people, and I'm speaking mostly adults, but start to dig in, maybe they're going through a deconstruction or an unlearning or a relearning. Did you feel like you had that experience yourself as you started to create the Book of Belonging and kind of dig in?
Did I have a deconstructive experience?
Yeah. Or just like an unlearning. Like I think a lot of people, when they start to dig in, they want to pull away.
I see. Yeah.
And it sounds like it drew you in. And so I'm wondering if you have some encouragement for people that maybe turn away in frustration.
Yeah.
Instead of allow it to pull them back.
Yeah. I mean, I think that some of it is just like a personality thing, that I think that I'm someone that when I am confused by something, or when I am intrigued or want to fix something, that is my nature, is to sort of just dive in head first and to not give up until I've got it sorted. But I know that I have other friends who are like, I just need to walk away and take a moment. Like that's how they deal with something.
Yeah.
So I feel like when it comes to deconstruction, sometimes I feel like I've seen out there this sort of, it's taken on sort of a negative connotation in certain circles, that people are like, well, you can't just walk away. But it's like, that's how some people deal with conflict. That's how they sort through and find what really matters. And it ends up being this really beautiful process. Like, I mean, like we were just talking about, like, that's what Jesus did, right? Like, I'm not saying Jesus deconstructed. I mean, probably, but
probably
that he withdrew to a quiet place to sort through, and find the truth at the core of, the story. And I think that I have friends who maybe on a surface level, it looks like they've quote unquote walked away from faith. And so I would say, to answer your question, for people who are sort of struggling with that, like I would say, trust the story and trust that, trust the way that God has put you together. That if your intention is to find meaning and to find truth and to find the way of the kingdom, then God goes with you. no matter where you are. If you're walking away, quote unquote, or if you're like withdrawing to the wilderness, you're not leaving God. God goes with you. You might leave church, but that's a different story. And the two things are not the same.
Right.
But I would say, trust that God goes with you and continue to do that good work. And I feel like, man, people are so different. They just have different ways of learning as well. Like for me, it's been like, you should see my desk right now. I have about 15 books stacked up. And that's how I learn. And that's how I sort through confusion. But I know there's some people who are like, I'm going to go fishing, right? Like that's how I'm going to sort through all this stuff in my head. I'm just going to take a fishing trip, or like, I'm going to go for a long run. And I think the important thing is trusting that God goes with you and engaging with God every step of the way. I don't know if that answered your question.
No. It's great. It's great. Well, it's like you mentioned earlier, just because the name of God wasn't mentioned in the story doesn't mean that he wasn't present there.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's why this podcast is called Becoming Church, because we do realize that God does not live. I mean, it's not Old Testament time. Like he doesn't live in a box or in a tabernacle or, that his presence is everywhere, and that we can actually take that out into fishing or wherever we are.
Yeah. And I think to carve out spaces for church, like church in the like the concept, not the place, wherever you do go, whether you're on your fishing trip and you set up a camp with your friends and you engage in a conversation about the truth that you are seeking, like that's church. Or whether you go for your long run, and while you're running you pray for the people that you love, and one of them that comes into your mind, then you go home and give them a call and check in on them. Like that's church too. Like you're taking God with you, and you're this sort of Abrahamic idea of God's people being meant to be a blessing to the entire world. Like that's what's at the core of church, like whether we're in the building or not. So I think regardless of what a like deconstructive process may look like, we also have the ability, to have that God goes with us, and also that we at any given moment in any place have the opportunity and really the mandate to be a blessing to those around us. And then that's when we're creating church.
We can live out the love of Jesus without ever saying his name, if that's what is required in the context or with the people that we're with. All right. So one last question for you. In all of your researching and writing the book of belonging, is there a woman or another maybe person in the Bible or a story that you've discovered and like gotten to know better in your research?
I would say the character that I have been the most fascinated by, and I'm still just enamored with, is Hagar. So most of us know Hagar from the story of Abraham and Sarah. That they, God gives them this promise that they're going to have this great nation, and then it just doesn't happen. They don't have any kids. They don't have any kids. So finally, Sarah seems to give up on the whole promise and says, all right, well, here's my Egyptian slave. Sleep with her and maybe through her, we will be blessed. And then this like really terrible, tragic story, it says that Sarah brutally oppresses Hagar when she does become pregnant. And the verb that they use is the same verb that it's when they talk about the Egyptians brutally oppressing Hebrew slaves.
Oh, wow.
It's that same sort of like brutality. So Sarah treated Hagar with this brutality, and she ends up running away, and she encounters God. And it's this really, really beautiful story of this ultimate outsider. God comes to her, and she ends up being the only person in scripture to name God. And she says, you are the God who sees me. And it's this really beautiful story that sort of flips things on their head of as far as like the first becoming last and the last becoming first. It's this really intriguing story. But the more I've dug into the character of Hagar and learned she represents so much to Black women. And I have been reading a lot of womanist theology and womanist midrash,
Mm-hmm.
and learning what she represents for them. I feel like in most of my reading and study, probably because I'm reading and studying a lot of white theologians and white scholars, Hagar, it's really interesting. She is described so differently by so many different scholars. She's villainized in a lot of stories, and she's the
Wow.
hero in other stories. And I think the thing that I've taken away from the story of Hagar is that so much of it is about perspective, and how so much of the way that scripture has been interpreted and taught is biased. And I find a lot of hope in that, doing the work that I'm doing. But Hagar specifically, it's just the story. I feel like she makes me speechless. I've just learned so much through, I think, the way that she traditionally for me was sort of either just like a side character or a villain, but to see how she's a hero to women in the Black community, and to see how she's a hero to a lot of marginalized people, it really was very humbling for me to read and to learn and to think, wow, I need to sort of rethink, first of all, the sources that I'm reading. I need to broaden my research, but also, like, man, I want to carry this understanding of perspective into every story that I read, and to consider, like, whose story is not being told in this interpretation, who's being overlooked, and who's being held up as a hero when their actions are not entirely heroic. Like, Sarah acts so terribly. Objectively, when I zoom out, I'm like, she is a terrible woman. Like, she is.
Yeah.
But Paul refers to her as like this model of female piety in the New Testament. So I think we sort of like work backwards and sort of treat her that way no matter what. But these characters are so much more complex when you dig into the stories. And the longest answer ever to your question was
That's
Hagar.
okay.
If I could tell you one person to do some research on and learn more about, it would be Hagar. It's just fascinating to learn everything that's out there about her.
Well, and really what I heard at the heart of your answer is be aware of the lens that we're looking through, that we're reading through, that we're listening through. And I think that applies to not only scripture, but even the voices in our lives, in media, like so many things. I just loved some of the questions that you asked of, like, who is being villainized and why, and through whose eyes, and who is being held up and why, and again, through whose eyes. I just think there is so much that all of us can learn about the world, about ourselves. And that's where that unlearning and relearning can just be this beautiful thing, to not necessarily say what we were taught was wrong, but maybe it's just one perspective.
Yeah.
Maybe there's other ways to view it too.
Yeah.
For a bigger picture of who God is and what was actually going on,
Yes, exactly. That's what I was going to add, is like, I feel like I always want to make sure that I'm clear that at the end of the day, it's not even about the characters. It's about who God is. That's my whole concept for this Bible, is like, I want kids to learn who God is and who God says that they are. And I think the thing that was really hopeful for me in the whole Abraham, Sarah, Hagar love triangle, whatever you want to call it, is that God is so good to all three of them and so patient with all three of them, but also that God consistently, and we're still working on the book. I'm still writing it, but I'm, at least in the Old Testament, God is so consistently responsive to people who are unjustly oppressed. He'll always answer the call of someone who's being unjustly oppressed. And to me, that was really hopeful, was like, all these characters are screwing up in so many ways. Like, and that in a way is really encouraging. But I think the thing that was also encouraging was, like, I think what holds true and what I needed to hold true in these stories, and I'm always so relieved when it does, is that God is so good, and that God is on the side of the marginalized, and that God is on the side of the unjustly oppressed. And I think that there's a lot of hope there.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. I cannot wait. I contributed to your Kickstarter. Is it still going?
Thank
Is
you.
it still active?
Nope. So we did 30 days. We raised more than we had hoped for. And now we're just diving in on the work.
Awesome. And so if people want to get in, if they're listening to this conversation, they're like, okay, but I want one when it comes out.
Yeah.
Where should we send them?
We currently have a wait list for people who are hoping for copies of the book. And for good reason. I don't want to be cryptic, but we're in some meetings about opportunities we have to make the book more accessible, geographically more accessible, because we only shipped to the US at the time, and financially more accessible. We felt a little uncomfortable during the Kickstarter saying like inclusivity and diversity, but having a $50 book, I realize, is not inclusive for everyone. So we're talking about ways that we can make the book a more accessible price point and more widely available. And while we take those meetings and figure those things out, we have a wait list on our website, thebookofbelonging.com.
Awesome. And where can people find you besides thebookofbelonging.com?
They can find me on Instagram. I'm Mariko, Mariko Clark on Instagram.
Awesome. And we will link it up in the show notes. This has been so delightful, so lovely talking to you.
Thank you, Kristen. Thanks for chatting with me.
Yes. All right, guys, thanks for listening to the Becoming Church podcast. You know where to find us, but just in case you don't, we'll link everything up on social media. Please make sure that you share this with a friend. If you know of parents who are looking for a new way to talk to their kids about the Bible, send them the Book of Belonging, send them this conversation with Mariko. Also, rate and review the podcast. It just helps other people to find it as well. All right, guys, we'll see you next time. Bye.